then. Hello, everyone. I'm Anne Ryan, and I'm a Feasta member, and just taking on the role of welcoming you here tonight and introducing Caroline a little bit, introducing the paper. Caroline, we're here really on to the focus of the discussion. The presentation and the discussion will be a paper that Feasta, on Feasta's behalf, Caroline Whyte recently wrote, researched and wrote, and she's called it Moving the Economic Goalposts of Irish Agriculture. And our discussion will focus, after Caroline's presentation, our discussion will focus on biodiversity, farming, and the well-being economy in Ireland. And this paper was presented on April the 28th, initially to a wide group, and Caroline has incorporated some of the feedback that she got on April the 28th into what she's going to present tonight. And of course, this is Biodiversity Week, so that's partly why we chose to hold this event this evening with Insight as part of the Biodiversity Week events. At the introduction of the paper, one of the people who responded said that moving the economic goalposts of Irish agriculture was important, but actually we need to change the playing field for Irish agriculture. And I think there's been so much wonderful stuff written, and there's so many great groups working to do just that in Irish agriculture. And I think this paper that Caroline has done makes a unique contribution to that conversation that's going on about agriculture, in the sense that it looks at the systemic pressures and how to ease those systemic pressures on farming. The systemic pressures that force people to act in certain ways, and how they could be changed to, but number one, to ease the pressure on the economy to expand, so that we don't have to be constantly expanding and could be independent of economic growth. And there are some mechanisms that Caroline has identified that would help to do that, including expanding the social wage hugely, and that would include the provision of a universal and unconditional basic income for everyone, also through specific tax policies and through debt relief and debt restructuring. So Caroline, of course, has written the paper and is the expert, so I'm not going to go on much longer. Just to say that, to remind you again that we are recording. Caroline will present with some slides, and then afterwards there will be an opportunity for everyone to make a comment or to ask a question, and we'll tell you the procedure for that after the presentation. And we will finish by 9 o'clock, so you don't need to be anxious that we'll try and get you to stay on longer than that. So Caroline, I'll hand over now to you.
Thanks a lot, Anne, and welcome everyone. And I hope you can all hear me okay, because I know my sound can be a bit funny, but great, that's brilliant. So I'm delighted to have all these people here. It's a real privilege to be able to speak about this tonight, and thanks for coming and for your interest. So like Anne mentioned, I've had the opportunity to write this paper, and the paper, as she's given a very good quick overview about what it's on. What I'm going to do is share my screen, and I have also put a link in the chat, which is a link to the paper, which you can have a look at if you like. And of course you can download it obviously and read it later too. And the slideshow will have a lot of basic bits and pieces that are drawn from the paper, so you'll get a reasonable idea of it just from listening as well, if you'd rather not bother looking at it right this minute. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully it will work. Here we go, share. Okay. So it says people can see it, so hopefully that's right. So here we go. So yeah, the paper it's called Moving the Economic Goalposts of Irish Agriculture. And since this is Biodiversity Week, as Anne mentioned, I'm going to have a bit more of a focus on biodiversity in this talk, although actually really a lot of the things I'm talking about would affect all planetary boundaries and not only biodiversity. But there's a very good reason to link biodiversity and farming, which is that as I'm sure a lot of you know, and I'm not going to read out all the little tiny green text here, don't worry, you don't need to be able to read it. The point of this particular graph is that you can see there's these two long bars at the top, both green, and they represent the impact of agriculture on habitats in Ireland. And you can see, compared to all the other sectors, which are the other bars further down, it's really got a huge impact, and both in terms of threats to biodiversity and also in terms of pressure on biodiversity. This particular data comes from the National Park and Wildlife Service, and it was referred to. I took the graph from a really good paper that was put out by three big groups: the Environmental Pillar, Stop Climate Chaos, and the Sustainable Water Network in Ireland last year. And I'm going to be drawing from their work a little bit here and there because they have a lot of good things to say about biodiversity. So you can see from this first graph that agriculture, I'll just read out a couple of the other things in green so you can see what they say. There's forestry has somewhat of an impact. There's infrastructure, somewhat of an impact, infrastructure construction, there's alien species and so on. But agriculture is really up there, it's got a big old impact. This chart here, the one on the right, is about the whole world, and it's a famous diagram which is showing planetary boundaries. You can see around the edge of it there's climate change, biodiversity loss, land system change, freshwater use, and so on. And here again, it's basically just to show the impact of agriculture on biodiversity loss. And various people have been worried about this for a long time, and I came across a really excellent paper by an ecological economist based in Barcelona, and it's called Biodiversity Policy Beyond Economic Growth, and it was written just a year ago or so. And one of the things that she recommends, and I totally agree, is that we need to look at finding ways to impose caps on actual resource extraction and the bringing of resources into the economy, and also have protected areas where there's just no extraction allowed if we're really going to be serious about protecting biodiversity. And meanwhile, in Ireland, we have a farming system which is quite diverse, and there are various different things going on, and its impact on biodiversity is diverse as well. But the particular sectors of the farming sector itself, which rely on a lot of monoculture, pasture, and a lot of high fertilizer inputs and high levels of nitrogen runoff and so on coming from them, they have a particular risk for biodiversity, and this is mentioned and it's described in detail in the paper I just talked about, which I'll link to later so you have the link. The picture on the right there, it looks like a heap of coal. It's actually a heap of fertilizer, and so it's being used basically for high input farming. So a lot of dairy would be that, not organic, but other kinds of dairy here would be rather intensive high input, and some tillage, for example. And again, one last quote from that paper. It says, we believe that incremental changes at farm level will not restore ecosystem services, species and habitats as long as intensification remains the core goal of agri-policy. So what they're getting at here is that, even though individual farmers might want very much to change or to do things better, it's very difficult when the whole policy and all the economic pressures and so on are pushing them in a particular direction. And some might manage, but that doesn't mean it's easy for all of them to manage. So it's what we'll be looking at today are ways to try and change the whole, playing field, as Anne put it, not just the goalposts even. So one of the challenges here is that if we actually look at governance of the EU, we already run into problems because, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy, the very first two objectives of it in legal terms have to do with expanding productivity. So, it says you need to increase agricultural productivity. This is one of the core objectives of the CAP, by promoting technical progress and so on and so on. And then it also says, thus to ensure a fair standard of living for the agricultural community. So there's a kind of implication there that you actually need to be expanding productivity, which implies using loads of inputs and, impacting biodiversity and so on, just in order for people to be able to make a living from farming. And the latest round of CAP reforms is seems a little bit more enlightened, at least on the surface, because you can see these are 10 objectives all in a circle here, and most of them are pretty, seem all right, at least on the surface. Competitiveness I'm not too sure about, especially since they include little rockets, which isn't the most ecologically friendly thing in the world. It really depends how it's defined. But the problem is that these other things here, these legally binding objections, the objectives, they actually have precedence. I mean, they can, you know, and they have been used to argue against some of these other measures, you know, being implemented very profoundly, because, you know, if you're supposed to be emphasizing productivity, then that kind of acts as a kind of default, you know. So there's some governance and structural problems there, and as well as that, there are also economic problems, because farmers' share of the value chain, the amount of food, I mean, sorry, the amount of income they get for what they're selling can be really poor, you know, depending on the kind of farming and the way it's being sold and so on. But on average in Ireland, it's 18.1% is the share of the value chain. In other words, that's how much of the overall profit from food, or the overall revenue from food, that they get. And that's really not great. It's not good at all. In the EU on average is 25%, which is still low. So this is a big economic pressure, and it's very hard to not want to expand what you're doing if you're not getting enough money from what you're doing. So it's, you know, there's an issue there to do with power along the value chain, and power in terms of your selling, your ability to name prices when you sell, and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the problems with productivity and, I'm sorry, productivism, expansionism, you know, having an economy that's focused on that. I already touched on it earlier, but, you know, on the EU level as well, even if you go beyond the cap in agriculture, there's a kind of, it's sort of plastered, the laws are plastered with references to things like economic growth, the need for you know, increased productivity and so on. And, but there's been loads of research now, and this picture on the right here is from a book from the European Environmental Bureau. There's been tons of research indicating that it's just really, really hard to decouple environmental damage in absolute terms from economic expansion. So if there's a way to achieve well-being and to make sure everybody can thrive without having to focus on expansion and increasing production all the time, then that would be really, it would make it so much easier to achieve the ecological transition and to have a green economy. So in other words, we need to change our relationship with GDP growth. And I won't read this whole thing out either, but basically it's from that publication I just showed, Decoupling Debunked. And it's basically, the idea is it's not just a question of becoming more efficient about production. It's also a question of sufficiency, of making sure everybody has enough, but, you know, that also there are limits. You know, you can't just continue producing infinitely and consuming infinitely. So some of the other models that have been proposed for having an economy that could work better within ecological limits, a very famous one is the one on the left here, ecological donuts, that Kate Raworth came up with. And basically the idea is you've got the planetary boundaries around the edge that I mentioned earlier, and you need to make sure that you're protected, they are protected rather, that you're not going to go and break through the ecological ceiling of the economy and breach those boundaries. And you also need to make sure that everybody's needs are met, and not just physical needs like water, food and health, but also social or political needs like having political voice, social equity, gender equality, all of those things. They're also very important. So the question is, how do we find our way into this donut? And there's an alliance that works, you know, very closely with Kate Raworth, called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a network of organizations around the world that are all working on this issue and looking at ways to reorient the economy away from expansion and growth as an end in itself and towards well-being instead. And Feasta is a member of that, and we are part of a hub in Ireland that are working on that, a hub of different groups that are working on that. And just one more thing about the economy as a whole. I like the donut idea, but I find that it tends to be a little bit, it doesn't get across the idea of movement. And so I kind of like the idea also of trying to get across this idea of balance. Kate Raworth talks about a balance, having an economy that's in a state of dynamic balance. And so, as Anne mentioned earlier, the things I'm going to talk about in this paper are ways that I would see of helping the economy to stay balanced and make sure everybody gets what they need, but you're not damaging the environment at the same time. So I'll go into detail about what they are in a minute, but I like the idea of the bike because it's something that's actually moving and you're going somewhere, but you're not necessarily accelerating. That would be growth, you know, but you're going somewhere and you're covering ground, you know, and there's something going on. Within Ireland in the west, we have some farms that are high nature value farms, and these farms, unlike the ones I mentioned earlier, the ones which have a lot of inputs and are very dependent on fertilizer from external places and so on, these ones tend to have much less impact ecologically, less of a bad impact, but they tend to be more marginal. So again, you know, just tying in with this idea of the donut and finding a way to survive. I'm quoting here on the left from that paper that I mentioned earlier by the Pillar and Swan and SCC, and just, because to me it ties in very much with the ideas of the Doughnut, that we need to, in order to ensure that farms like that can manage and get by economically, we need to make sure that there are areas where they are doing well enough economically. So there need to be basic services and infrastructure in rural communities need to be improved, and there needs to be new economic opportunities for HMV stands for high nature value related goods and services, and basically it's an empowerment issue as much as anything else. So I'm going to move on in a minute, but I just wondered, does anybody have any comments or questions at this point, or is there anything that you'd like me to clarify, or I'm going to talk about basic income and social wage in a minute, but just wondered if there's any thoughts.
Sorry, hi. I was just wondering, what's the definition of a high nature value farm? How is that measured?
That's a good question, and off the top of my head I can't tell you, but I could easily find out for you. It would be in the paper. I'll tell you what, I'm going to paste the link to that paper into the chat as well, so you have that. I'll find that now. So at the moment, if you look at the map on the left here, this is from the Central Statistics Office, and it's just showing how different regions of Ireland have different levels of disposable income. And Ireland, I mean, there's a taxation system in Ireland that's, compared to some countries, it's fairly progressive. I mean, there's some countries have much larger, inequality in disposable income, in other words, income that they get after taxation. But there is somewhat of a disparity in various regions of Ireland as well. And so the darker regions there, were Dublin and Kildare, basically, they're the areas where people have the biggest disposable income after tax. And then the kind of olive green areas, like you can see Mayo, Leitrim, Donegal and so on, Kerry, they're the areas where there's the lowest income. And part of what we want to do is to get these areas revitalized and make it easier for people who want to settle there and perhaps engage in some kind of agricultural activity to be able to do that. So this particular graphic here I have nicked off Social Justice Ireland, who works with us on the Wellbeing Economy Hub, and I like it because it brings together the idea of having a really good protection social welfare system, both in terms of making sure there's essential infrastructure and services like universal basic services, but also making sure people are financially okay as well. So in my paper, one of the things I argue is that there needs to be both a basic income and a social wage. And the social wage, it covers a lot of different things, but basically it's about things like education, healthcare. I would consider adequate housing in there as well, which is a big issue, of course, in Ireland. And also things like access to, public common goods like museums and libraries and so on, and good public transport as well. So all of those things kind of go together, and then universal basic income would be, it's an income that everybody gets who's a resident of Ireland. And I argue in the paper that I think it should be enough that people can live on in a simple way. Maybe not in Dublin, it wouldn't be so easy, but in some parts of Ireland where, the cost of living is a little lower, where people can live. So I do a bit of calculations basing with the idea of a universal basic income of €250 a week. Let me just carry on here. I'm not going to read out every single number here. It's a bit, head-wrecking. But basically, thanks to John Baker and David Quinn, because they're from Basic Income Ireland, they came out with a really good paper, which I reference at the bottom here. And it's on the Basic Income Ireland website. And what they've done is they've been trying to figure out how a basic income in Ireland could be funded from income tax. So it's a very kind of understandable way of doing it. And it's there are other ways that it could be funded as well, but I thought I would go with that way of funding it because it's kind of something everybody can understand, and the money is there basically. What I did do though was I slightly changed their calculations, because following a suggestion in their paper, because their basic income was set a little bit lower, and a couple of years have passed, and I thought it would be good to make it a little bit higher, especially with all that's going on with inflation and so on, excuse me. So basically on the left there you got gross income, so that's income without anything taken off taxes or whatever, and you can see it's a very simple idea. It's just, say if you earn €10,000, then if you were in you know, 2000, by the way, it's 2018 because they were the most recent statistics I could find. If it's 2018 and, you know, you're taxed, you don't lose anything on that income. But if there was this basic income that we're talking about, and I use the costings that John and David suggest, then you'd actually end up ahead because you'd end up with 17,500. So that's just one example. And then if you go up the kind of range of incomes, then it's I don't know, I don't want to unpack this in huge detail because we've got lots of things to talk about, but basically the idea is it's progressive. You know, as you go further up the income ladder, you're paying out more, but you'll end up with a more equal society, which in a lot of ways has been proven to be a really good thing in many ways. And this is actually the same idea as in the last table there, but it's just more graphical, you know, or it's a graph. So basically the green line there is it's what you would get with a UBI. So for example, on the left there you got your gross income, and say you've got, you know, say your gross income's about what is it? Wait, now, am I making sense here? Basically, anyway, it's comparing what you get, what your disposable income would be with after it's taxed, with what your income would be with a UBI, and the green line is above the blue line for the low kinds of income, because you would be getting more income from the UBI. But once you get up to higher bits of income, then you would be getting less income overall in the aggregate, so you'd be paying out a bit more. So it's basically the same idea, you know. And these are rather tentative because it was very hard to track down data for regions and who in Ireland and who earns what, you know, on a household level, you know. So I did a bit of number crunching, but I may have got it somewhat wrong. So I'm being very careful about this. But anyway, I think, you know, for example, if you're somewhere like Donegal and your average disposable income in Donegal in 2008 was about 16,500 roughly. If you were in this system with the UBI, it would go up a fair bit. It would go up to almost 20,000, you know. So that's deliberately chosen as a very low income area, but it's just to give an idea of how these things might pan out, you know, if they were to happen. And then Meath, which is a more sort of moderate income area, you would still actually have a jump in income because, you know, from about 21,000 to 24. And again, that's because, you know, it's still under average, and it's still basically because of the way the costings are done, you would still get more back. And then obviously as you go up, these are all averages anyway, and as you get up higher, you know, you would end up paying out more. Okay, so one of the problems that people sometimes come up with or think might happen with a basic income is that you can end up with inflation. Now, in some ways, that sort of doesn't make sense because you're not, especially if you're not introducing any more money into the economy, you know, you're not, you know, if there's no more money overall in the economy, then there can't really be inflation. But it can work in it makes sense in a certain way, in the sense that if people are then fair, you know, say the money is going to tenants and the UBI, I mean, and then they're paying it on to landlords, and landlords then put up their rent, you know, that kind of thing. You can end up with property inflation or like rental inflation, or, you know, even inflation in property values and that sort of thing. And I think there is somewhat of a risk of that. And one of the ways to make sure that can't happen is to introduce taxation that makes sure that you're paying, or anybody who is benefiting from the value of land that they own in a way that's they haven't earned, like that they haven't contributed to themselves. Anybody who does that has to pay a tax on it. So that's the idea behind the site value tax. And so basically site value tax, it's something that's an idea that's been around for a while, and some countries have it to a varying degrees. Some cities have it in different parts of the world. And it's a way the way it works is that if you own a house and you live near a light rail or something like that, and that puts the value of your house up, you know, the fact that there's this light rail close by, then the value of the land that your house is on is assessed, and you have to pay a certain percentage of that value every year, and that's the tax. And it's different from the kind of property tax that they have in Ireland at the moment, which is local property tax, which is assessed on the sale value of the entire house. Like, so for example, with a local property tax, if you insulate the house or you do something, you know, to improve it, it's going to increase its value, and that means that it's going to be, you know, more the tax. There's a risk that you go into a higher tax band and have to pay a higher tax, and so it could be a discouraging if you want to do something to make the house better in both in terms of energy use, for example. A site value tax doesn't suffer from that problem at all, and it also is a way to make sure, as I say, that you're contributing to the infrastructure of your area, which you're also benefiting from as well. This picture here on the right is by Henry George. It's a billboard by supporters of Henry George, who was a very early proponent of site value tax and very articulate. And so basically, it's the idea I've just been talking about. You know, it's he paid. You know, somebody paid for this lot, and they're going to hold it and basically hoard this land until they get the money back. And if there was a site value tax, it would be much less attractive to them to do it, because they'd have to pay a tax on it all the time, even if they weren't using it for anything. So, as well as the advantages I just talked about, you know, the environmental advantages, you know, where you're not penalized for improving your house, and also the advantages of not, you know, triggering any inflation in property values, there's also this advantage that it can stop speculation on property, and so, you know, we want to try and make sure that people have access to housing, especially in Ireland, where it's really not easy to get housing at the moment. So this is a way to help with that. It's not a cure-all, but it's a way to help with that. And site value tax it's a kind of commons-based taxation, and this ties into the whole idea of the commons, which is something we talk about a lot in Feasta as well. And in my paper, there's an appendix that explains a little bit more about that. That basically, you know, their commons are collectively owned, collectively managed common pool resources, and there's all kinds of different ways to manage commons, and there's been loads and loads of research about this over the years, and they're kind of an alternative to either having the state run everything in a top-down way or having individuals run everything as private property. So it's it's just another way of organizing resources, or, you know, also information. There could be digital commons as well. So a couple of examples of taxation that's based on commons is what I was just talking about: site value tax or land value tax. And you can also tax speculation on financial transactions. That's another example as well that's been talked about a lot. And when I was starting this paper, I really wanted to include there's a slight difference between site value tax and land value tax. And land value tax includes farmland. And I wanted to see how it would work if we included farmland. And then I actually dropped it because I chickened out, because when I did the sums on it, I realized, you know, it's going to be really expensive and for the farmers, and, you know, some of them be I know some people are earning loads, great, you know. Some people, it looks great on paper, but it's not so great in reality. And I think there's a lot of pressures already, and I just felt like, let's drop this for the moment. But I think it's something good to keep in mind, you know, for later. And in the paper, I explain a bit more why, and I have a little bit of, you know, numbers to back it up. But in any case, site value tax that would apply to properties, I think it is would be a really positive thing. And it's being discussed pretty seriously these days, I believe. I mean, the Commission of Taxation and Welfare has been talking about it, for example. So it is something that's being tabled at the moment. Though, you know, where it will go, I don't know, but hopefully somewhere. And about 11 or 12 years ago, the Smart Taxes Network came out with a book with Feasta called The Fair Tax. And this map here, which is unfortunately 10 years old now, but it just gives a little idea of the sort of range of property values that there are in Ireland, you know, and the dark areas are, as you can imagine, are the areas where property is most expensive, and where the site value then would also be most likely to be more expensive. So, you know, again, it's a way of redistributing or circulating money and making sure that, you know, it gets to where it's needed. I'll just show that. I'll just juxtapose that with the household disposable income I was talking about earlier. And it's not an exact correlation, but it's you know, still there is a certain, you know, amount of common ground literally between, you know, the wealthier areas, you know, in the east, for example, and then the higher disposable income areas. I mean, the higher property value areas and the higher disposable income areas. So that's so far. I see Anne put a comment in the chat. Shall I carry on maybe, or anybody got any questions now? I'll pause again. No silence.
I do, but I'm worried because I'm the only person who's had a question so far.
Oh, please go ahead. It's great to have a question.
Well, I have heard people talking about vacant property taxes as a way to try and ensure more, accessible housing and to remove speculation. So I was wondering why you chose to go with site value tax. What's the difference and why is this the one you chose?
I mean, from what I understand, I certainly wouldn't be against a vacant property tax, but the site value tax is just goes further. I mean, it would also cover vacant properties sort of automatically, but it would cover all properties. So it's just a bit more profound, if you like. But yeah, I certainly wouldn't be against a vacant properties tax.
So it's just broader.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh,
We have this issue with housing in Ireland, and introducing a site value tax could help with some things, but it's probably not going to be enough because we do have this enormous bubble, big property bubble, and basically a lot of it, since the great financial crash in 2008, there's been various things that have inflated the bubble, and part of it is actually kind of out of the hands of Ireland itself in a way, because it's partly because there's been the European Central Bank's quantitative easing program, which has basically encouraged a lot of investment in assets like housing, and it kind of encouraged this bubble to come. Now that's not the only problem. Obviously, there are other things going on in Ireland too, but there's we do have this real issue where there's it's very hard for other people to afford housing, and then there's also a problem with debt as well, and difficulties in paying mortgages and so on, and also in terms of farms, it's kind of there's a rather disturbing correlation, if you like, between high input farming and high debts, because a lot of the farmers who take on a lot of, or who are dependent on inputs and are very, expansionist in their approach, they tend to have been encouraged to take on debt because, that's the idea. If you want to expand, you need to have, capital, you need to be able to invest in infrastructure and so on. And now, with the war in Ukraine and so on, there are getting to be issues with, being able to afford the inputs, being able to afford fertilizers and so on. So there's a danger that, some of these farmers could run into real problems and, end up losing their land or having, other problems like that happen, and, financial issues. So there's various ways that we can help with debt, but one thing which I should mention first, and I should have mentioned earlier, really, is that I did touch on it near the beginning, but is that all of these things I've been talking about, they need to happen in the context of very, very firm environmental regulations. And I think I did mention that there needs to be caps on resource extraction and bringing resources into the economy. And this is really important to bear in mind for all of the things I just mentioned, like UBI and taxation and so on, but also for debt, because debt is a very fraught issue. It's something you have to use you need to be very sensitive when you talk about debt, and you need to take the needs of for example, sometimes the creditors are just savers, they're pensioners or whatever. Everybody has responsibilities, and you need to be very careful to take everybody's point of view into account. But I think that something does need to be done on a systemic level about debt. And basically, as I've just mentioned, you've got a lot of pressure on the Irish property market, and there's also problems. Actually, sorry, I'll get onto that one in a minute. I'll carry on debt for a sec. So in the paper, I suggest a few different things. And first of all, on the EU level, the kind of systemic level, there's a few interesting ideas floating around. And I think it would be really good if economic policymakers were to look at these seriously and just really think about the impact of debt, and ways to reduce debt and to make the economy less sort of balanced on debt, as it were, because it's really not very compatible with an economy that's not growing. That's the problem. If you have a lot of debt, that puts pressure on the economy to grow, because you need to pay back debt, basically, so that there's pressure on to have a lot of economic activity. And that's funny. Oh, here we go. I know what happened. This is the one I wanted to show. Yeah. So basically, for example, they've done some calculations in Germany, and they found this, an awful lot of economic activity was happening just to pay interest on debts, or just to pay back debts or whatever. So a lot of these things aren't necessarily very useful or conducive to society, but they have to carry on, because otherwise you're going to make the whole system unstable, because the debts won't be paid off. So there's a real, it's like it's a cultural construct, the whole debt phenomenon, but it needs to be looked at very seriously, I think. And so, for example, in the paper, I talk about a few different ideas, not in detail, I just touch on them. But there's Steve Keen, who's an economist, who has some ideas about debt jubilee and paying back debt. You have to be careful with paying back debt, because if you just cancel all the debts, then there won't be enough money. So there are various things to juggle here, but there are ways that you could introduce more money into the economy at the same time, and that would make it easier to balance things out and make sure you compensate for any problems. So then there's also something called the International Movement for Monetary Reform, which we're a partner of in Feasta, and they have a lot of good ideas too about ways to introduce money into the economy and replace money that's based on debt. And then there's modern monetary theory as well, which is very focused on the power of governments to bring money into the economy, on their own terms. I have a few caveats about some of these things, but and I won't go into huge detail about them now unless somebody has questions later. But basically, the idea, there is systematic things that are systemic things that can be done about debt, and I think it's important to be talking about that, and thinking about these different options. And then on the level of Ireland itself, there are various ways of providing relief from debt, but they aren't perfect. They have some issues, and I talk about this in the paper as well. And I my own kind of hunch is that the systemic approach is really vital. There are sort of short-term stopgap things that can be done in the meantime, but thinking about it systemically is really important. Okay. And then finally, the irony is, while, it's some people, including some farmers, have found it very easy to take on massive debts, at various points. It's been very hard for other people, including some farmers, to access credit. And so, again, it depends a lot on where you are, what you're doing, and so on. But this is a very well researched area as well, about basically how to get finance into an area where there isn't enough money floating around, like the areas where there are the high nature value farms, for example, in the West, and keep the money circulating in those areas. And so there's this quote on the right here. It's from one of the founders of Feasta, Richard Doughnut, from years ago, but it still applies. If anything, it applies more. Basically, you put money in a bank in the west of Ireland, and it just goes somewhere else. And money just leaks out really quickly. And now, of course, in Ireland we have bank closures and so on, and it's the choice has got even narrower in terms of banking. So there's loads of ways basically to invest in communities and keep money circulating in the community. And so there's a few here which I grabbed from another slideshow I did, I have to admit. So there's community shares, where you buy a share in a business basically for a modest amount, and then it's very much the same idea as community supported agriculture, where you're basically you're buying a share in something that's going to be produced later on, and that's supporting the people who are producing whatever it is. And a good point that Ollie Moore made, from ARC 2020, he made on my paper, was that earlier on I talked about UBI, universal basic income, and universal basic services, and he pointed out that for farmers who have a community supported agriculture scheme, it's like they're basically providing a service for people in exchange for a basic income, so it's like a little system in itself, which is clever. So then local investor networks, that's where you're deliberately investing locally, in a broader sense. And then community wealth building is a very specific idea where, you basically you identify big institutions, usually state-owned or local authority-owned, and you invest, you make sure that their procurement policy is locally focused, so that you're supporting local enterprises and local businesses. And this is a really good model. I mean, it's got a good track record. It's been used in the US and the UK very successfully, and it's been very good at revitalizing areas that were quite deprived. But it's got more of a record in urban areas than rural areas. And then community banking is a great one. And again, that's something that I think is a real gap in Ireland, and that it would be good to really explore and look at, because some countries like Germany, for example, they have this very thriving public banking system, and it's really does seem to have protected them from the financial crisis, very well, in more, rural areas of Germany and so on. So, yeah, all of these things are really useful, and very good to keep in mind. So that was a kind of overview of that. I think I haven't covered everything, but basically the whole idea, all of these things are things that are meant to keep the economy in balance, like to get back to that idea. And so, if you like, there's another way of looking at it too, which is, if we go back to the Doughnut idea, we have this theory of change in Feasta. And again, there's an idea of balance. You can see there's 3 supports there. And if you take away a support, 3 supports for the Doughnut, I mean, if you take away a support, then it will fall over. So again, there's this idea that you need to have, all of these different kinds of measures to hold up the economy, to allow it to function properly. So I'll just carry on. I'm almost done with the slides, and then we can talk a bit more if anyone would like. So basically, in the paper, I make some recommendations, and there's some that are more sort of on the legal end or governance end. For example, like I mentioned earlier, the EU's treaties, the kind of core legal documents, are kind of plastered with references to growth and how important growth is and productivity expansion. And, this is, at best, this is confusing, and at worst, it's actually quite dangerous, I think, because it's not realistic, it's not scientific, so it would be much better to replace those, not replace the whole treaties, but replace that wording, change that wording, make it focus rather more on societal ecological well-being for the economy as an economic goal. Then, as I already mentioned a couple of times, I think there need to be really strong environmental regulations which represent the outer edge of the donut, basically, so including caps on resource limits or on resource extraction and imports, and also some areas just need to be no-go, you can't extract at all, you can't go in and mine and so on. Communities need to have the right to say no, for mining. There's a whole area there to do with mining, which I won't go into now, but, and then, there's a nature restoration law with regard to biodiversity, which is being delayed at the moment. And, it would be good if that could be passed, because it's got a lot of good things in it, I believe, and then again, just to get away from this idea that we need economic growth. So the IPSCS, that's I'm not going to be able to remember what that stands for, but it's basically the biodiversity huge scientific body, like the IPCC for climate, basically, that comes out with assessments and so on. And both of those bodies, IPSCS and IPCC, they've got a little bit more careful about the way they talk about growth, but it's still in there, and what would be really helpful is they both like to use scenarios a lot, and they sort of project, what will happen to the economy if we do this or that or the other, and what will happen to the environment, what will happen to climate and so on. If they could include scenarios that don't have growth, that would be really helpful, because it would just broaden the whole, narrative, and, change the whole playing field, basically. So then these are the things that I talked about that could be done on an economic level and policy level. So I won't read every word again, but these are all, I think I've covered all of this. So I suggest we introduce a UBI, a universal basic income of €250 a week for adult residents of Ireland. And by the way, there'd be a child benefit as well as that. That needs to happen along with a strengthened social wage, which, by improving universal basic services. And then I also suggest that the local property tax be replaced with a site value tax. And, oh yes, I didn't mention that. The site value tax, part of what's nice about having this source of revenue is that it could be used to, you can I'm thinking that, in the future, farms or rural areas will probably need more employment. And that's a controversial idea because, not everybody agrees. But I think, it's because that there's going to be a different relationship to energy and production, and there's going to basically be more work with the hands again. Not only work with the hands, but there'll be more than there is now. And so it'd be good to have situations where it's easy to hire people to work on land, and where it's easy for people themselves to go into business in some way, in agriculture, were easier than now. So if there could be a shifting in the tax burden away from employer tax and also entrepreneur, or business tax and so on, more towards site value tax and that kind of tax, which basically is, it doesn't discourage people from undertaking labor or work or whatever, then that could be really helpful. And the other thing I didn't mention was the housing fund, because there's a lot of rural housing, or especially in small towns and villages, there's a lot of vacant housing, and there is a program now to try and encourage that to be used more, especially with the housing shortage. And if there was a dynamic where people had a UBI and a better social wage, and they were able to settle in different places more easily than they are now, especially younger people who are less likely to be have mortgages or constraints that make it hard to move around. If there was a situation like that, and then there was it was easier to find housing, then that would be another huge help as well. So basically, the idea is to get more people living in an area and able to sort of be economically active in the area. So there is this fund, and it would be good to see it extended. And then I mentioned the ideas of the debt intervention and debt restructuring. One thing about debt restructuring, if it's happening for farmers who are on high input farms, where there's a very big ecological impact, is that, because debt restructuring is always very carefully tailored to the farm and the income and so on, there's a possibility there of introducing some kind of biodiversity, framework as well, or a way to encourage more biodiversity restoration on the farm. And just one detail I should mention though, and some of my colleagues have said this from the IEN, and it's really important. If there's going to be biodiversity, a focus on biodiversity, it's really important to take into account the existing biodiversity, and not only focus on new biodiversity projects, but also what's there already is really important, because sometimes or often I think it gets ignored, or it's not, policies don't take it into account enough, and then there's no incentive to keep it, or it's harder to keep it because you're under pressure or whatever. So it's a detail, but it's very important to keep in mind, I think. And then as I said, support for values-based financing. So what I'm calling values-based financing, what I'm calling values-based financing is financing models that are based on trying to revitalize a community, keep money circulating within the community, and basically make sure that you're emphasizing the kind of economic activity that you want. And I mentioned something called terre de liens there. That's a French, basically a land, trying to think how you'd call it. It's like a land trust, I suppose, where people, if they want to, they can put a little bit of money into it, as much as they want, and then the money gets used to buy farmland that comes on the market, or sometimes it's given to them as well. And then it's only allowed to be used for agroecological farming. So in other words, farming that doesn't have a high ecological impact, that's beneficial ecologically, and it has to be used as farmland in perpetuity. So it's a way, and then it gets leased to farmers at reasonable rent. So basically it's a way to ensure that young farmers, or farmers of whatever age, who want to do agroecological farming, it's a way to help them have access to land. And so it's it's just another idea or another model, but it's maybe one of the ways to get out of this trap of it being very hard for some people to access farmland when they need to. I kind of, in terms of biodiversity, finally, because that's supposed to be a focus after all here, any biodiversity policies at all, they ought to be growth agnostic. In other words, they shouldn't be dependent on positive GDP growth. And this ties in again with what I was saying about, the big bodies, the big assessment scientific groups, and, the legal documents and so on. We need to get away from this assumption that the economy, whatever we do with biodiversity, it has to protect economic growth, or it has to allow economic growth to happen. So long as everybody can get by and everybody's happy, everybody's comfortable, has what they need, and has their social political needs met, then you don't really need the growth. It's the big point here. So yeah, that's the end of that in terms of the presentation. I don't know. I'd love to hear any comments or questions or thoughts. Or
I'll come in for a second, Caroline. Thank you very much for that. Was quite a marathon for you. And we're going to invite people to make comments and questions now. So I think we should be able to see the entire screen. Well, we are onto 2 screens, but it should be safe enough for people to put their hand up, and we'll be able to on the screen, we'll be able to see who wants to speak. Just to say, if you have a comment, we are going to ask you to keep it to 3 minutes maximum, and we will warn you and cut you off if you go over 3 minutes. Sorry to be bossy about that, but we need to do that so everyone who wants to speak gets a chance. And then if you have a question, it'll be obviously a little bit shorter. So and then we'll take breaks so that Caroline can address the questions. I hope that's okay, Caroline. And I see there's one question in the chat already from Mary Tubridy, and she was saying our credit unions are equivalent of local banking. So I don't know if you want to address that one quickly, Caroline, and then we'll, because that's a kind of a clarification thing, and then we can see what others want to say.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that credit unions in Ireland, they certainly perform some useful functions, but they're very limited. They don't have the same power as banks, so they don't have the same kind of leverage in terms of keeping finance in the community. But they do certainly have a function for sure. That could be improved as well. It could be improved. Could be expanded.
Credit unions lodge with their banks, don't they? They take their money and they actually lodge it with the big banks.
That's right. Yeah.
So in fact, they're just like a bigger customer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So we have Declan and Thomas lined up. So Declan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Caroline, for your presentation, and I agree with a lot of your recommendations. I've a few comments and a question. I guess from my perspective, focusing on a just transition, one of the key aspects of that is the cross-sectoral benefit of trade union organisation. And I appreciate within agriculture this is limited, and you've got the distinction between agribusiness and smallholder farmers. But yeah, I just wondered if your paper clarified the role of trade unions, and if you'd looked at the power of La Via Campesina and the way in which that operates throughout the world, and the way in which Ireland can, or Irish farmers can benefit from their work and learn again some of the practices that are in existence in other parts of the world.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Via Campesina, but I actually didn't mention it in the paper, and not for any particular good reason. I might actually add something in about it now you mention it. But we did have Bridget Murphy from Talamh Bio, which is the Irish, I'm sure you know, the Irish affiliate of Via Campesina. She gave me some feedback as well earlier. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, as you say, there are various power things going on here, power dynamics. There's the whole agribusiness, pressure from agribusiness, which I didn't talk about much just now, though I kind of alluded to it a bit when I talked about the value chain, because it ties in with all of that, doesn't it? But yeah, I think there's an awful lot that can be learned from the Via Campesina for sure, and it's impressive, both in terms of its scale and in terms of its, its integrity and what it's working on. So yeah, thanks.
And then Thomas.
Oh, hi there. Sorry, I'm not turning my camera on. I'm actually listening on my commute home in London, but just to say, excellent talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I haven't read your paper and I'm really looking forward to reading it. So a question which may be answered in your paper, but on debt and the role of banks in Ireland, I'm interested to hear, did you explore the sort of connection between there's growing private finance that wants to, it's not an individual, but we know that private finance is wanting to invest in nature, and there are various mechanisms and initiatives that are helping to support that. But from an Irish context, given the fact that the number of banks has contracted, that the market is limited, is there a role for international finance to support investment in nature and public payments for public goods, but sort of using private finance to support that, de-risking capital? You know, I'm interested to see if that's something that's you explored, or you think there's a role for that in Ireland. And this is support biodiversity in general.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question too. I don't explicitly explore that in the paper. I suppose I touched on it a little bit when I talk about sort of ethical investment funds, or, you know, value-based investment funds, although, you know, there are caveats. I mean, one has to always be very careful with these things. There could be greenwashing and so on, of course. And as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of I mean, anecdotally, I've heard that there's, you know, this thing happening at the moment now of investment funds coming in and buying up farmland to plant, you know, in order to offset emissions, to plant with forestry and that kind of thing. And so, you know, it's a bit of a fraught area, and I don't have a quick and easy answer, but, you know, in theory, I think it would be great if there was a way for people anywhere to, you know, put money into something that was definitely going to be sound and, you know, ecologically sound. But yeah, it's just something where that's a bit fraught with hazards, and that's partly why I have such an emphasis on capping resources and you know, extraction of resources, and where you can't do that directly, imports of resources, because that's something that's easy to monitor and where you can be sure, you know, that you're actually doing something that's having an effect, you know, whereas some of these other things, they can be very hard to monitor. So it's just, I'm not saying that this is impossible or not worth doing. I think so, there are some really good funds out there, like Terre de Liane seems pretty good, and I see somebody posted a reference to a UK fund there in the chat, you know, so I think there are some really good things going on. But I think, yeah, there's other measures are needed as well, like more on the regulatory end. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's similar where my mind is at. I was just intrigued. I mean, there's tensions in Wales, there's tensions in Scotland already, you know, around the role of private finance investment offsets, and it's fraught with challenge. But yeah, there is a role for this finance to go somewhere, and if we can direct it the right way, then that's got to be a good thing, hopefully. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah,
thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's important to say this is, well, I think this is a fantastic paper. It's a link in the chain of everything that we need. It can't be comprehensive, so it's drawing attention to other things that need to be investigated and brought to the fore as well. So I don't see any other hands up. Has anyone like to come in with a comment? Well, wait a minute.
I suppose I will again, the person who's asked so many questions before. I really thank you for putting together this report. It's really, really good, and I think very necessary now. I guess I'm half commenting, half asking questions here. Might excuse me if I'm a bit disjointed, but I've just finished a master's in sustainable agriculture and rural development, so I'm thinking a lot about rural communities and farming as a cultural practice, and how, for example, currently only 1/4 of Irish farms are economically viable, which is kind of a complicated term, but it means that the other 75%, the people who work on them earn less than minimum wage, essentially, for their time farming. So as a business, farming doesn't currently make sense, and they're not doing it as a business. Most people who do it are doing it sort of as a cultural practice and a hobby and a heritage practice. So I think it's really good looking at how that the high nature value farming and supporting people to farm in a less productivist way also enriches that cultural piece and makes rural livelihoods more meaningful for people, because you're now engaging, let's say if you're doing community supported agriculture, you can feel like you're farming for the good of your community and not to export beef to Brazil or whatever. So I don't know if you've considered the cultural impact on this kind of thing in the paper. I didn't get to read the whole thing, but if there's anything you'd like to talk about on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's really important. And I mean, I don't think I explicitly talk about culture, but I do. One thing that does strike me, and that I've been struck by, in the research I did was, just the importance of people having access to land, and families who've been on land for a long time being able to stay on the land as much as, to the greatest extent possible. And, and I think there's, it's interesting because even, some of the farming groups who would be, in Ireland, who would be very much expansionist, who wouldn't be high nature value, but would be more, interested in, expanding productivity and so on. Even they, for example, they tend to be against mining on their land or whatever. It's like there's, there are limits, and there's a culture there of, keeping the land for farming. But I think, yeah, what you're saying is really important in terms of, keeping community life going. And one of the side effects, as I'm sure you know, of EU policy and the CAP, and their emphasis on productivity or productivism, I should say, because that's that's the ideology of producing, is that there's actually been fewer and fewer farmers and bigger farms around the EU. And, then, when the CAP brought in, when with the direct payments and so on, that did keep some farms going. But as you say, a lot of them are just really very marginal and not really able to survive financially without assistance, so there's this weird sort of double system, and yeah, it does seem like if there's another way to handle all of this, it would be much better, for loads of reasons. And there's also, as I'm sure there's some resentment too, I think, about, I mean, different types of farming, and some of them think the others are sponging, or and others think they're sort of raking it in, by doing bad stuff. And so there's a lot of I think there's a lot of tension there as well. And it would be great to find, part of what I'm trying to get at with this paper is to look at things that kind of affect everyone. And what are the real problems here? What's really causing this tension and these difficulties? Because I think there's all these other dynamics going on in the background, and it's easy to just forget about them and just focus on the immediate problems or what you see happening in your community. With people having to move away and so on. And it's easy to forget that there might be other things going on that are influencing all of that in the background. So that's part of what I was trying to get at. And Anne has just posted a link, I see, to a book by somebody who just was in one of our podcasts, Chris Mage, who's a smallholder farmer in the UK, and he writes very eloquently about community, and it's very interesting what he writes. He's an anthropologist, but he became a farmer, so he has a lot of stuff online as well, so it's worth checking him out if you don't know about him.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that book, it strikes me that what you're talking about, the systemic interventions you talk about, Caroline, would support the kind of small farm future that Chris is talking about in that book. And so I see Marag and Hugh and Natasha have their hands up. Marag, are you going to come in?
Hi, yeah, I was just sitting here, and as usual, I'm in the Eco Village in Clough-Jordan, and I'm a Dublin person, and I'm not a rural person. I mean, I've lived here, but it just strikes me, there's this, and I feel it, the tension between like the Eco Village environmentalist and maybe conventional farmers around, but on a bigger scale. This is, and the vitriol against, for example, Eamon Ryan and the Greens can be quite high. And I'm just wondering, in this group of people here, I know of one person put in the chat that they're starting farming, and I know my neighbor farmer is here. But I suppose I'm wondering, is this kind of an echo chamber that isn't, I know this is cross-sectoral, and I appreciate that, but I'm thinking of the paper and how to get to bridge these, tensions and gaps, and to engage with farmers and farming organizations. I mean, I'm guessing there's no one from the IFA here. I have this feeling no one has declared themselves. And I suppose I'm keen. I just love, Caroline, I'm really impressed with this paper, and we need so desperately to engage with each other. I mean, everyone needs to engage And I just wonder, have you thought of, I know you invited lots of people to both, and in the other one there were farmers as well, but you know, I'm talking conventional farmers. Are there any here, and why not? And I mean, I kind of know why not, but you know, how do you see the future, a way of getting through with something like this, which tries to be, you know, I can see you're trying for a sort of a neutrality and to be whilst being growth agnostic. So yeah, that's my question. How to bridge the gaps.
I'd love other people's ideas about this. My own idea is, which, you know, I'm still working on really, but I think it's breaking through silos is very important. It's weird actually, by the way, working on this paper has made me realize how many of the metaphors we use are actually farming related, like the silos, and you know, oh, just as I keep coming into different things like getting bogged down and so on. But anyway, sorry, that's an aside. Basically, the idea is that, you know, in the paper, I'm trying to get past the kind of, if you like, the sticking points, the things that's make it very hard to find common ground or to agree. I'm trying to identify things which are kind of common in the economy. And the thing about it is, part of why it's challenging though is that it's not within an obvious remit of any department. I mean, it falls into loads of different departments' remits, and you know, all of these measures, like, you know, there's no one department that can come and say, right, we're going to do all this, you know, even if they wanted to. And it's the same even for research institutions. I've had a hard time figuring out, I mean, I've had some brilliant feedback and input, you know, but it's been hard to, you know, even just getting everybody together in one space, I think would be really, really helpful, you know, if there was a way to do that, you know, because I think I'm kind of leaning towards just maybe approaching policymakers in some way again, and seeing if, you know, there's a way to, you know, or if there's some way to have a discussion, you know, but yeah, in order to be willing to engage with this whole idea, you have to be willing to, you know, sort of think beyond assumptions about the economy that are very often made, and that can be hard, I think, especially if you've been really trained to think, you know, in a certain way about the economy. That can be challenging, but I haven't lost hope about it, because I think a lot of people are thinking different ways about the economy nowadays, and I think there's a generational divide too. I think a lot of younger people are very aware of things like Doughnut economics, wellbeing economics. It's just an impression I have, but I've heard it from various people. I've heard it from people working in big institutions like the European Commission and the OECD and so on, you know, that there's you know, a real interest, especially in the younger people, in that kind of thinking. So yeah, I think, you know, it's just keep talking about these ideas already is important, you know, and the more people who know about them and think about them, the better.
Thanks. Can we just check if there's anyone here who is farming? Oh, you did say, Marek, that your neighbor, the farmer, was here. So does anyone want to comment if they're a farmer?
I can comment, but I feel a fraud because I'm just beginning to create a regenerative farm up in Donegal. So, but you know, I'm surrounded by conventional farmers, and you know, the discussion earlier today was about, well, how are we going to, you know, if everything that your people what happens, Ronan, you know, how are we going to feed people? You know, but then I also have at the back of my head, you know, in the latest IPC, not the one that came out yesterday, but the third one, the like incredible stats about 700 million climate refugees within Africa alone, and you know, in the framework of your paper, all I can think is, you know, that's a changed world, because that's not just in Africa. There's things happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And you know, the world will look very different.
Yeah.
So I don't have any particular questions or whatnot, but that's kind of where I am. But I think the day-to-day conversations I'm having with conventional farmers around me are really important. And when I see myself planting trees or doing something, I know I'm being watched.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Ronan. Thank you very much. And Aoife has said she's from a farming family in the chat, so thanks for that. So we're getting, it's just after 9:15, so we have Hugh and Natasha, and I see Declan has his hand up again, so hopefully we'll have time for that. So Hugh, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you. Caroline, your paper is a very important paper, and I think, like many other papers, it's there to show people part of the way forward. But like more, I feel that we are sort of in an echo chamber. As a member of Basic Income Ireland, I know all the work that's been done up to now, but nobody is listening, and we have lots of neoclassical, if you like, ministers for finance and so on around the place who don't want to change. And we also have, as somebody mentioned, the disunity within the country of people who want change, but haven't come together to make that change happen. And that's I think, a tragedy in our case in Ireland, because we need change to happen more rapidly in this country because it's so small, and we need every one of the citizens to be on the same playing field, if you like.
Thanks, Hugh. Would you like to comment, Caroline, or was it eloquent enough?
That was very eloquent. Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. There needs to be change, and it is tragic that, you know, it can be so hard for people to get past, you know, superficial differences or short-term differences, or however you want to put it, or you establish common ground. You know, I totally agree. I mean, I suppose I have more patience than hope at the moment, let's put it that way, but I do have some patience, so I just keep trying.
Thanks. And then Natasha, please.
Hi. So yeah, I hope I can make myself coherent here. So one of the things, because I'm doing a master's in biodiversity and land use planning, is that, you know, I see that the whole universal basic income will support farmers, but as Aoife pointed out, a lot of farmers, especially in the West and the Northwest, are hobby farmers. How do you see, instead of supporting the farmers, like taking biodiversity out of the equation, I feel that that's the approach that's happened here, but how do you feel about putting back biodiversity in the equation? And for example, small farmers in extensive farming is responsible for a lot of the fantastic habitats we have. So we really need to not just support them in hobby farming, because they might move away from that if you know, as they get older or whatever, that we need to encourage them to continue building the biodiversity. And you know, the question about including farming, you see, there's a big difference. IFA represent ag industry and big farmers. There's small farmers in the West and the Northwest would love people to have conversations with them about how they can continue as farmers. But we also need to get, and they're not that far removed from understanding how they used to support curlew, corncrake. You know, Hen Harrier Project is a fantastic example. When the farmers were asked to get involved, they were so intrigued. I think what rural people are allergic to is other people telling them what to do and not asking them to engage in the conversation. So the conversation, I guess my question is, rather than seeing the economic support biodiversity, how do we bring biodiversity into the equation? And I think looking at small farming, like I have this notion of the whole Belmullet Peninsula being a fantastic area for biodiversity, and continue extensive farming. I've been there, you can see amazing wildflowers. People have 1 or 2 cows in a small field, and there's loads of stone walls, and you know, no one's making any money. Anyway, but it will be so sad if in 20, 30 years that just didn't exist anymore, because no one's making any money. And if you abandon land, it will turn into scrub and something else. I think you understand my point. Sorry for being so long-winded.
Thanks.
No problem. Yeah, so I guess there's a few different things here. You know, in the paper, I'm not. First of all, just to be, I'm not a big expert at all on the specifics of biodiversity on the land. I mean, from everything that I've heard from people who are more expert than me, is that it's very bespoke. Like, it's like you say, it's people who are place-based on the land, the farmers themselves, and so on. It's sort of something that's, they might want some guidance or something, but it's they're the ones who know the land, do you know Farming for Nature at all, the group that yeah, so that, as the way they've put it, and I've attended some of their talks and things, is they want to engage farmers' hearts, and and help them to encourage them to support biodiversity because they care about it, and I think what I was trying to get at with my paper was kind of creating wiggle room so that people have more space to care about biodiversity, because I think most of us actually really, even if we don't know all that much about it, we really love the biodiversity in itself. I mean, just being in nature and so on, it's just so good for you. It feels so good, being in the forest or being in a biodiverse area. And I think, if there was more wiggle room economically for people, to make their own choices about what to do, including, with farmers in marginal areas, like you say, financially marginal areas, that could help. Now, I'm sure also the new CAP, there's going to be various eco schemes. You probably know about that, right? And, where there's, payments for protecting biodiversity and so on. And, and you probably know also that there's some of them, it's not quite sure how they're going to be, monitored or whatever. But and also there's the whole hazard that I mentioned earlier of making sure that you're protecting existing biodiversity and not just engaging in new projects and so on. But it's a bit like the investment thing that we were talking about earlier. I think there you have to be a bit careful, and there are caveats. But in theory, I mean, in practice, hopefully there could be some really good things happening. But the UBI that I'm talking about, you probably realize that it's a different thing. It's nothing to do with cap payments or anything like that. It's just something that everybody would get. And the idea is that it would form a basic kind of floor that, along with the services as well, that would make it, easier to try out all kinds of different things, and including, finding ways to protect biodiversity. So it's indirect, it is indirect. It's not as direct as something where you're actually coming in and actively paying, for protecting biodiversity. But my hope is that it would help, because I think it's relieving pressure is really important, because it gives people more room to think and figure out their own solutions. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, thank you, yeah.
I see Declan's hand up, and we have just 7 minutes left. So I will check just to see if anybody else wants to come in who hasn't had a chance so far, before we invite Declan to speak again. Is there anyone else? Okay, thanks. Declan, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Just picking up on Morag's point, and with reference to Ronan and Hugh, I think that the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity loss is a key opportunity to engage, and I would encourage everybody on the call to engage in it in some way. I think that I was kind of alluding to that whenever I referred to La Via Campesina, because there's a lot to learn and a lot we can interact with on an international level. And the trade union concept of a just transition certainly takes into account the way in which we engage with farmers, whether they're in a union or not. And my conception of a just transition includes, local communities interacting with trade unions and with farmers. So I just wanted to give a further example, a sort of more hopeful philosophy in relation to a submission I'm making to the Citizens' Assembly with some other colleagues regarding the rights of nature. And it's a philosophy, it's less of an emphasis on the legal side of things, although that can be helpful. And the benefit, I think, of that is that you're talking to farmers and to, everyone looking at the way in which nature, should have legal rights in themselves. But even if you don't accept the legal rights, I think it's a sort of universal way of thinking about the issue, that farmers can be part of the discussion. And there's just those those couple of points I wanted to make and sort of try and, you know, bring a bit of hope and, you know, along with the patients.
Thanks again, Declan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I need to look into the whole rights of nature phenomenon, because I'm not as up on it as I'd like to be. But yeah, it does sound like a really interesting, a really good idea. All right. Yeah. I think, as you say, you know, I think it's not only about legal matters, but the legal angle is very important. And yeah, bringing in, you know, that angle on the rights of nature does seem like a good idea, as well as the things that I measured in the legal measures that I mentioned in the paper as well, because all of these things, they do affect policy, you know, as well, obviously. I mean, what I've been told, for example, is that now with the war in Ukraine, you know, the somewhat more progressive new CAP reform objectives, people are pointing to them, like high impact farming groups are pointing to them and saying, you know, we you know, these are just provisional anyway. You know, the real objectives are the core documents that say we need to expand productivity, you know, and that's the legal, you know, situation. And, you know, what can you do if it's against, you know, not against the law, but if you're challenging, you know, something legal. So yeah, thinking of it in those terms is important. It's not the only, Morag says, never waste a good crisis. Yeah, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the important things, I guess.
I think we're coming to an end. I'd like to thank, on behalf of everybody, Caroline, I'd like to thank you for your efforts in preparing the paper and sharing it with us tonight. I really, I got so much out of it, even though I have, you know, I had already read an earlier draft. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. And it's usual at the end of our Feasta events to remind people of what the word Feasta means. It's the Irish word for into the future or henceforth. And I suppose we persevere, and I think you said you have patience, Caroline. So I think we need that, but we need to dig where we stand and do what we can wherever we are, and hope that all the good stuff joins up together into the future. So Gora Mila Magriv, as Fehogan Anocht. Thanks everyone for being with us.